early teachers learned to read and write the language, learned to conjugate verbs on paper, but really struggled to speak the language. They were very frustrated by this. You could sense it. The whole group was extremely frustrated. And I can remember this moment as a young person, I was in my early 20s, and there was this palpable sense of frustration. As though after 5 years of work, people thought we'd all be fluent, and they weren't quite sure what to do with the fact that we weren't. And of course, in hindsight, I look back and I laugh, but we really thought that, and we were frustrated by it. And that led the Myaamia Youth of Oklahoma to begin to think about reinventing what we were doing. And it eventually led to the creation of what was initially called the Myaamia Project, and is today called the Myaamia Center. It was initiated in 2001 at the request of the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma. The Myaamia Tribe has a long, now 40-year connection with Myaamia University in Oxford, Ohio. And they contacted Myaamia University and said, would you help us establish a language research office at your university? And that we could find a way to share the costs, but that this language office would help us become a think tank for our language revitalization efforts. And so the Myaamia Project was launched in 2001 with Daryl Walden as the sole employee and director. It had two initial goals. The first was to conduct in-depth research to assist tribal education initiatives, specifically at first in language, then abroad. And the second was then to share what we were learning with students at Myaamia University. This is again to continue our tradition as many communities have of reciprocity. So Myaamia University is giving a lot to us. We try to give as much back to them as we could. Just this past winter, the Myaamia Project evolved into the Myaamia Center. We continue to strive for it. The knowledge must be continually striven for. There is no end to that. We must always work. And the center, in the simplest terms, it means we're now permanent. The university saw a project as temporary, and now they see us as permanent. It also equals increased resources and increased staff. Now there are 5 full or part-time staff in the center, and eventually we should grow to 7 within the next additional 5 years. The center became a think tank for the tribe, and in lots of different ways beyond language, because as many of you in the room already know, language isn't a thing that you possess, it's rather an expression of your life. So when you begin to revitalize language, you begin to change everything about your community, and you land on a whole new series of questions that literally shape the foundations of a community in both very painful and very good ways. And we realized that we were going to have to think about who we were in ways that our ancestors never had to. They didn't have to consciously think 3 generations ago on how to pass on their language. We learned it in the home. We learned it because it was the means of expressing interaction and communicating your daily needs in the home. You didn't need to think about what your knowledge system was as a people. You didn't have to think about your cultural boundary. You didn't have to think about your ecological cycles in an abstract sense. They were just a part of the rhythm of life. But because of the damages our community endured when our language went dormant, now these are things we have to begin to, in many ways, abstractly theorize about, philosophize about, wrestle with, and then figure out how we're going to reconstitute and revitalize our efforts, and actually revitalize our entire community. These are examples of some of the models that we created as we did these things, as we revitalized elements of our community like our lunar calendar system, which has been dormant for far longer actually than our language has been dormant. And it is quite an endeavor, one that's as important implications for us today. And then my favorite is the Myaamia here, the frame. In our research into educational traditions within our community, I hit on some pretty key information together with Daryl Walden regarding dreaming within our community, and dreaming's connection to the development of youth. And dreaming being a key way that youth within communities found and established their place within their village, and also found subtle ways to challenge their religious norms, to change collective behavior. The youth had the power to do this, and their dream was powerful enough. And what you find in the early Jesuit records about Myaamia speaking peoples is they specifically say the key to changing these, and they're specific here, young men, the key to making them Christians and making them think like us, like the French, is to stop them from dreaming, and they say it. And for me as a teacher, that was a really powerful moment, because again, we were seeing the dirty inner workings of how our community became damaged. And seeing and identifying the things that we can potentially heal in our community to revitalize and strengthen who we are. In our work, we tend to position ourselves not as in juxtaposition with what we call global knowledge systems, but as in overlapping. While global knowledge systems sometimes depict themselves as standing against or domineering minority language groups, we realize that it's not fruitful for us to accept that fight, or it's not one we can win, but rather to carve out a space for ourselves in the world that we all share. And so our young people, our scientists, they're businessmen, they're linguists trained by the academy, but we see that as a space that overlaps these global knowledge systems, and we can talk to our youth in very concrete ways in our own language about how our system is different and unique, but not in competition with other systems. This is a project that we're currently working on, looking at creating a Myaamia specific developmental chart to begin to look at our language materials and target them not just to what an educational psychology book says is the key developmental windows, but also looking at what is our language tell us are the key developmental windows. And something that, which should be no surprise to, again, most in the room, is very intriguing to me as I work with a lot of college age students, is that in our traditional system, which was functioning healthy all the way through the 1800s, you weren't an adult in our community until you were about 25 years old. And one of the key disruptions that elders pointed to in the middle 1800s that was happening is they said young people were getting married too young. They were taking on the mantle of adulthood at 16, 17, 18 years old, and our elders found this as a travesty because you can't be an adult until you're more mature. And at least in my experience with college youth today, that tends to be the case where they don't fully behave in ways that I consider to be adult. Perhaps the same is true of me. You can see a zoom in here where things are also, once you pass a certain age, gender divided. And so we realize that specific materials, specific acts of revitalization of language teaching also become gender. This is something that creates friction within our community today because many have accepted the broader American society's idea that genders are, quote, the same, and that all education should be equal across genders. And that's something that historically in our community was not true, and one of the issues we'll have to wrestle with as a community is how do we want it to be today for us. But outside of theorizing, thinking about things in sort of broad, abstract terms and trying to figure out how to apply that to our community, we also work on a day-to-day basis with our youth. Myaamia University has a special fee waiver, a scholarship for Myaamia tribe citizens, and currently Myaamia University has 25 students that we deal with once a week in a class setting and multiple times outside of class, teaching a wide variety of topics, language and culture, history and ecological perspectives, and contemporary issues of sovereignty. Basically a civics class for our tribal youth, because we have no tribal school, and we're unlikely to have one in the near future due to our faith populations. So we take on a lot of those responsibilities at the request of the tribe. This image here is our youth during the ecological perspectives portion of the course, webbing together the ecological observations they made over an entire fall as the landscape around them changed. One of the most awesome aspects of Myaamia University's environment is that it's within our traditional homelands. And it's an old university. It was founded in 1809. So, once they clear-cut all the trees, they eventually let them grow back. And so now we actually have 200-year-old trees on campus that reflect the trees that were a part of our traditional landscape. Having grown up in the Chicagoland area, I can tell that's pretty rare. So for a lot of our needs, for harvesting activities, for example, all of our traditional plants and food are available for us on campus. The campus becomes our classroom. And this is the youth in the same class harvesting Myaamia persimmons, which is a delicacy among Myaamia people. It's pretty popular in Oklahoma overall. And Myaamia Wishikani persimmon pudding is a very favorite treat for my people. When I saw the observation forms that you're all going to be grading me afterwards, I thought I should have put some persimmon pudding to pass around. Would have been sure that it was. But it's really powerful for us to be able to step outside our classroom, and then this context facilitates the use of our language. Like, this is the context our language lived in for generations, and so all the vocabulary is already there for us. Because our language went dormant in the early 20th century, we don't have all of the names and vocabulary and verbs for all of the things of our world right now. We're struggling to create some of those, and I'll show you some examples. But we have all the vocabulary for this, and so it becomes a very fruitful location as this is my son playing basketball that pursues as we engage our youth in this. And then we work with these youth for 4 years, and kind of like parents, we send them out into the world. Some of them now are actually going directly working for their community, going to work for the Myaamia Center, Oklahoma. Some of them are seeking out graduate programs to study things related to our language revitalization efforts. And some of them are becoming teachers and going to work in the public school systems. And then during the summertime, we're stealing them away and teaching our programs. And so they continue to live into this goal of knowledge and responsibility for our community. So some of the key lessons that we've learned here is that our continued emphasis on ideology, on language ideology, changing the way people think about language is really, really important, especially once it begins to reach the community level. But our research focus broadened. We don't research just language. We're not only in the language record. We're in the historical record, we're in the ecological record, we're working with scientists and geologists on campus to look at various different issues connected to our health as a people. And our focus is not on just speaking language, but rather being good human beings, not revitalize. Speaking our language is a part of that, it's an essential part of that, but it's the means of communicating who we are as good people. It's not a possession that we own. And we switched our focus to youth, again defining youth as birth to 25 years old. And it moved a little bit away from adults. We focused youth in the home and focused in the context of youth in university. And we shifted our focus a little bit with adults to seeing them more as boosters. That they're not, for reasons that we haven't fully understood yet, there are not many of them that dedicate the time to learn to speak the language. They'll learn a few words, a few phrases. But what they will do is become die-hard supporters of their kids' efforts to learn and speak. That they'll be very different kinds of parents than the generation came out of the boarding schools. Again, because we're in a very different position. And so our support to them, to these booster parents, isn't to teach them to speak, but rather give them enough knowledge to support their youth. And then continue to search out and watch for those adults who do show special interest and an aptitude and a desire. And we do have them show up, they show up regularly. Adults who are just very good at learning language are really interested, and there's space for them. But we don't expend a lot of resources looking for them, wait for them to come to us. And of course, now our focus is more on speaking. Natural speech, worry less and less about translation, because translation is approximation anyhow, and trying to get people interacting with each other in the language for longer and longer periods. Not talking about fluency, but just talking about staying in the language as long as possible. And then that use needs a context, and that's what we realized, is that if our youth spend most of their time in the home, then we need the home, the context of the home, to support what they're learning and to be basically fettered with all the elements of our language. And then, as I hinted many times, continuing this ethic of knowledge and responsibility. Again, one of the challenges for us as a community is that when you do that, when you focus on youth, and you focus on knowledge and responsibility, your youth become your teachers. And this flips the traditional elder versus younger person notion on its head, because our elders in many cases don't speak the language, and our youth speak a lot. So we have to be very careful here. Our youth do not have the life experience, the historical knowledge, the geological knowledge that our elders have, the wisdom that they've generated over the course of their lifetimes. But our youth do possess an ability to speak and communicate with the language, and they have a desire to teach and share. So it's a very careful line we have to walk. Thus far, it's been greatly successful, and a lot of grandparents rave to us about their little kids teaching them to speak the language. It's about the goodness of which they come to it again. It's not with pride and arrogance, but with an honest desire to share. The next environment that we've worked to establish language in is our youth programs, our A1 Zapata programs, which means sunrise in our language. And this has been our most successful environment for increasing language use within our community and increasing bonding among our youth. So that there's a shared sense of collective identity among them. As I said, our community is fragmented across 47 states. We have 3 population centers, but they're fairly separate. And so this program becomes a place where our youth can come together, bond around the learning of their cultural traditions and their language, and establish a very strong sense of shared identity. Because when they go back home and they go into the public school, for most of them, there are no other Myaamia students in that school. So this is a place where they can develop a greater sense of community identity. This is from this summer's program where Portage is being taught. And then we ask these youth, we explicitly ask them to take what they're learning in this program home and teach their siblings, teach their cousins, teach their grandparents, teach their parents. Make what they're learning at the program live for them throughout the year. To help them create the context in their homes. Right? We bear some of the responsibility, but we need them as young people to take on this responsibility as well. And so this is a poster board that a young woman at our Myaamia, Fort Wayne version of the program, recorded the faces of the moon in our language, which connected to the lunar calendar project that she was learning. So that our youth could leave this program and then follow their lunar calendar throughout the coming year. And then the next year they come back together, they'll have a whole new series of insights around the ecological connections they made in their backyard to this lunar calendar that brings all of our people together. So you can see here, there's a goal to create bridges among all these diasporic families, create unity, but also recognize they're all living in different places, and they're all going to see and observe different things. And then teaching them to look back at our past in different ways. Many of our youth do not look like Kilsukwa, this image here, or Wabiwanga, her son sitting next to her. They don't dress every day in the traditional clothing that Kilsukwa did. But many of them in these programs descend from her. Many of them have ancestors who were named by her. She is woven into the nature of our community in very substantial and powerful ways. And so this past summer, they were looking at some photographs taken by people focused on the tourism industry in the early 1900s. And it was an interesting moment in their education where a young person held her hand, and they were comparing, there's one photo where Kilsukwa and her son are wearing the everyday wear, and the other one they're wearing the woolen ribbon work of the early 1800s. And on the woolen ribbon work photo, when they're wearing the feathers and headdress, it says in the bottom, last of the Myamis. And on the everyday photo, it just says their names. And one of the youth held up their hand and says, why does it say last of the Myamis? And I said to him, well, why does that strike you as weird? He said, well, because we're all sitting here right now. How could they be the last? And that as their minds become awakened to a variety of different things, they can then look back on these very powerful messages that are perpetrated on us by the broader society and push back against them, strengthen themselves through bonding with each other in ways that help us deal with some things that just sadly are likely to go away in our lifetime. And then as much as possible, we put the camera in their hands in these programs. And that's, of course, metaphorical in this case, real. 2 years ago in our program, the youth were tasked with making a music video. So they learned about traditional song and dance. And then their goal at the end of the program was to all together as a group record a song, we sing a track with the exact same song that was recorded with our college students at the end of the year at Myaamia University. So their voices mingled with the 20-somethings who are also learning about song and dance at the university. And they were tasked with creating images to tell the story of that song. And so little youth like this 10-year-old boy then, had the camera in their hands and dictated the shots and then told the film editor how they wanted the shots to go together as a group. And it was a really powerful process. But in a broader sense, that's what we're trying to do, is put the lens in their hands, give them the ability to direct the future. Because in the end, this language is their language. And in 20 years, 30 years, they're going to be the teachers. So they have to own it in terms of responsibility at the language against that. For Everyone's Appetite, we developed 6 core themes. And the idea with these themes is that we want our youth to have a similarity in educational experience. They come in as a 10-year-old, and they come into the rotation in a different spot, and by the time they graduate out as a 16-year-old, they've experienced these 6 themes. Every single youth who goes through the program will get the same 6 themes. Get them in a different order, get them by giving them slight improvements over time. But that way our youth all have a similar knowledge base from where they spring from. This again reinforces a sense of shared identity, strength of nation. And we use language as the life of the program. So we don't talk about language so much anymore. We don't teach nouns, we don't teach memorization. We use language to just feed ourselves. We use language in the act of cleaning food, in the act of preparing food, in the act of eating food, in the act of putting food in their plate, in the act of chiding you for not eating everything that was on your plate. And most of this food in these programs, again, is traditional food. We use language in the act of cleaning. So there's a lot of time spent in these programs cleaning because there's lots of messes. And so it becomes a huge part of the camp is actually cleaning up after ourselves. So we use language in that. And then most importantly, we use language in the act of caring for each other. So we use kinship terms to refer to each other. And when issues pop up, as they always do among 10 to 16-year-olds, we reinforce the meaning of kinship as we deal with the harm that young people sometimes accidentally or intentionally do to each other. And then we focus on building mentorship. We emphasize the knowledge and experience that our elders do have, the incredible value that our elders have to our community. We in no way ever think or speak disparagingly of this population. We should seek to connect their experiences and their knowledge with these youth in this program. But then we also connect our college-age youth to these kids there with Appetite. So our counselors usually come from Myaamia University students. And so they get a chance to take the knowledge they're learning at Myaamia University and become assistant teachers in this program. And our youth, through this process, find models that they can emulate. So it's one of the challenges that we realized is that, for example, someone like Darryl Baldwin, who's developed a pretty high speaking level, is that it's pretty hard for a young person coming in as a 10-year-old who has never spoken a word of Myaamia to imagine themselves being Darryl. It's too big of a leap. But we've created intermediate steps, people that serve as models of something they can attain. The young person at Myaamia University who has now learned a few words, and so that when they were 18 didn't know anything in terms of language. Or other young people who are now in between where Darryl and Brandon leaders are. And this has been really powerful. And in many really interesting ways, a lot of our young kids at 10 will start talking about how they want to go to Myaamia University. So we're going to have a population of goals to really get some of this. And then peer-to-peer mentoring. There are youth in our programs who are now growing up with the language in their homes from the time they were born. They're very, very comfortable speaking the language, and they're used to the context of community language use. And they become the proximate mentor. They're right there at the same age, they have some of the same interests. So that tends to be really, really positive. And again, I'm jealous. As a young person, as a young teenager learning the language, I just worked very, very hard to learn the little that I learned. And what I see now is with this kind of environment, young people just soar. They learn very, very quickly. And I'm jealous in a very good way of how quickly they learn. Some of these kids are achieving a speaking level that I currently have in half the time it took me to achieve it. It's a really, really positive thing to see. And again, emphasizing that knowledge is responsibility. We constantly ask them to take what they're learning home to their families. It's got to live beyond Zapata if it's going to live in our community. And we ask them to do that. Hopefully they don't, feel that it's a burden. No one's ever reported feeling burdened by that. But we definitely see positive results from this constant emphasis. And lastly, I'll finish up here talking about the changing community context. This is from this year's annual meeting of our governmental elections in Oklahoma that began with a round dance, which is sung completely in our language. And increasingly, as our language efforts with youth have increased, what we've struggled to do is to create a community context for that language. So we've had some success creating a home context. We've had some success creating context in Myaamia University, and some success creating language context in the Airways Alphabet programs. But we recognize we need a community context. We need to show up in governance. We need to show up at every community gathering as at least one of the major means of communication in that gathering. And this has started out in very small ways. It has now increased where most people running for office introduce themselves in the language and make some small statement in the language before they then go into English, as most of the voting audience doesn't fully speak the language. And perhaps this is exaggeration, but thus far, no person who has done that has lost election. Now, we'll see. I imagine that won't hold true as hopefully everyone will start doing it, and then someone has to do the election. But thus far, it's been really interesting to watch. And it's been increasing, working its way in lots of different ways. So now when my children go to community events, they hear the language spoken by lots of other people. It's not just something Nusa speaks at home to us and asks us to respond to it. It's something that lots of people use in these collective gatherings. It's been a really important transformation for us. And again, it's small, but hopefully growing. This has been parallel, oddly enough, with things that, again, aren't directly connected to language. For us, the reacquisition of land has been very, very important. There's a lot of community who was landless by the early 20th century.